Some stories find us when we need them most. This one came to me like an old photograph faded at the edges. But the face is still clear. It's about a woman named Clara Mercer, who kept a farm alive with her own 2 hands until those hands couldn't hold on anymore. And a man who rode into her yard one morning saw something that made him stop and never left. I reckon you've known folks like them. Hard-working people who don't ask for help, even when they're breaking. This story is for them. The rain slipped. Clara watched them fall through her fingers, leather dark with something wet. Something that shouldn't be there and land in the dust at her feet. Maven tossed his head. 17 hands of muscle and bone, and she couldn't hold a strip of leather. She looked down at her palms. The cracks had split open again. Blood pooled in the creases like rivers on a map she'd never wanted to read. Don't pick them up. Don't. Her knees didn't bend. Her arms hung at her sides. Behind her, a shadow stretched across the dirt. Long, still. She hadn't heard anyone ride up. "Ma'am?" One word, low, the kind of voice that didn't waste breath on extra syllables. Clara didn't turn around. She kept staring at the reins in the dust, at the blood spotting the worn leather, at Maven pawing the ground like he knew something she didn't. The shadow moved closer. If this story speaks to you, I'd love to know where you're reading from today. From the farmlands of Kansas to the hills of Tennessee, wherever you are. Pull up a chair. Good stories are better shared. She turned. The man stood 6 feet back, hat pulled low, one hand resting on the fence post she'd been meaning to fix for 3 months. Bay gelding behind him. No brand she could see. Saddlebags worn at the buckles. "I can manage," Clara said. He didn't answer. Just looked at her hands. She tucked them against her apron, felt the sting of cotton against raw skin. Maven snorted, stamped. The rain still lay in the dust between them like something dead. The stranger walked forward. Not fast, not slow. The way a man approaches a spooked horse. He stopped an arm's length away and held out his palm. Clara didn't move. "Let me see." 3 words. "No, please." "No, ma'am, this time." Her jaw tightened. But her hands came up anyway, trembling at the wrists. And she watched him take them in his own. His fingers were thick, calloused in lines that told stories rope burns. Reins held too long. Work that never ended. He turned her palms toward the light, and she saw what he saw, the cracks splitting across her skin like dry creek beds, the blood already browning at the edges. He didn't wince, didn't make a sound. From his saddlebag, he pulled a strip of cloth, white cotton, frayed at one end. He tore it in half with his teeth, then began wrapping her index finger, slow, methodical, the way she'd seen the farrier wrap a horse's fetlock once, years ago when Thomas was still don't. She counted his breaths instead, 1, in, out. The cloth wound around her middle finger now. Then the next. His hands moved like they'd done this before. Many times. On animals, she guessed. Maybe on people too. "You don't have to hold still." She held still. When he finished, both her hands looked like something from a field hospital. White cloth against weathered skin. He released her wrists and stepped back, brushing dust from his knees. Then he looked past her. At the barn, the roof with its missing shingles, the chicken coop leaning 15 degrees east, the fence posts rotting at their bases. His eyes came back to hers. "That roof," he said. "3 weeks before the rain takes it. Maybe 4? Clara's spine straightened. "I'm not hiring." He nodded once, walked back to his horse, mounted without a word. She watched him ride toward town until he was nothing but a dark speck against the white sky. But something in the way he'd looked at that roof made her think he wasn't done looking. The hammering woke her. Clara's eyes opened to gray light filtering through the curtain. Her bedroom, her quilt, the pillow still dented where her head had been. But that sound, metal on wood, rhythmic, steady, coming from somewhere outside, somewhere above. She lay still for 3 breaths, 4, counted the beats between each strike, tried to place the direction. The barn. No, not the barn. Higher. Sharper echo. The roof. Clara threw the quilt back and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet, cold even through the rag rug. She grabbed her shawl from the hook by the door, wrapped it over her nightgown, and moved through the front room without stopping to light the stove. The front door stuck like it always did. She yanked it open, stepped onto the porch, and looked up. A man crouched on her barn roof, silhouette black against the pink-gray sky. Hammer raised, arm coming down. The crack of iron on cedar splitting the morning air. The stranger from yesterday. Clara's bandaged hands gripped the porch railing. The cloth was loose now, coming undone at her wrist. She didn't fix it. "Hey." He didn't stop. The hammer came down again. Another shingle slid into place. "You get down from there." This time he paused, turned his head just enough that she could see the line of his jaw under the hat brim. Then he reached for another shingle from the pile beside him and positioned it against the gap. She'd seen those shingles stacked behind the feed store last week. Cedar. Good quality. The kind she couldn't afford. I said, "Get down." The hammer struck. Once, twice. Nails sinking into wood. Clara's chest burned. She crossed the yard in her bare feet, nightgown dragging through the dew-wet grass, and stopped at the base of the ladder propped against the barn wall. His ladder. She'd never owned one that tall. "You got no right to be up there." He drove another nail, then looked down at her. Hammer resting on his thigh. "Reckon I don't." "Then why?" "Roof don't care about rights, ma'am." He turned back to his work. "It just leaks." Clara's jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. The sky was brightening behind him, turning from gray to pale gold. And she had to squint against the light to keep watching. He moved along the roofline like he'd done this 100 times, maybe 1,000. His hands sure, his balance steady. 3 hours. He'd been up there at least 3 hours, judging by the stack of old shingles he'd already torn off and tossed to the ground. "Come down," she said, quieter now. "Please." He finished the row he was working on. Then he tucked the hammer into his belt, swung his leg over the roof edge, and climbed down the ladder. One rung at a time. No rush. When his boots hit the dirt, he turned to face her. Up close, in the morning light. She could see him better than she had yesterday. Lines around his eyes, deep ones, the kind carved by sun and wind and years of looking at horizons. Gray threading through the brown hair at his temples, a scar on his chin, old and white. He smelled like sawdust and sweat and something else pine tar from the shingles, still sharp in the cool air. "You lose that roof before summer," he said. "You lose the barn. You lose the barn. You lose the animals. Winter comes. You got nothing." Clara's throat tightened. She knew all of this. She'd known it for months, lying awake at night listening to the wind whistle through the gaps, counting the leaks during every storm. "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask for pay." "Then what do you want?" He glanced toward the house, the kitchen window, the thin line of smoke that should have been rising from the chimney but wasn't because she hadn't lit the stove yet. "Meals," he said. "3 a day. I'll sleep in the barn." Clara stared at him. The bandages on her hands hung loose, trailing white cloth against her wrist. Behind her, a rooster crowed. Maven whickered from the paddock, waiting for his morning feed. "I don't even know your name." "Holloway. Samuel Holloway." She waited for more. None came. "And you just fix roofs for strangers, for biscuits and beans?" Something flickered across his face, too fast to read. Then it was gone, and his expression settled back into that same unreadable calm. "I fix what needs fixing," he said. "When I find it." The sun crested the tree line, light spilled across the yard, catching the dew on the grass, turning the drops to small fires. Clara felt the warmth on her face, on her bare feet, on the raw skin under the bandages. She should say no. She should tell him to take his ladder and his shingles and his calm voice and ride back to wherever he came from. But the roof, the fence, the chicken coop, all of it pressing down on her shoulders like stones she'd been carrying for 18 months. Alone, always alone. "Barnloft's got a cot," she heard herself say. "Mattress is hay, but it's clean." He nodded once. "I'll make breakfast," she said. "Don't expect much." "I don't." She turned and walked back to the house, up the porch steps, through the door that still stuck, into the kitchen where the stove sat cold and the cast-iron skillet hung on its hook, and Thomas's coffee mug still sat on the shelf where she'd put it 18 months ago. Unable to move it, unable to throw it away, she lit the stove, cracked 4 eggs into the skillet, sliced bread from the loaf she'd baked 2 days ago. Through the window, she watched him climb back up the ladder, watched the hammer rise and fall, watched shingle after shingle slide into place over the holes that had been slowly killing her barn. When breakfast was ready, she carried 2 plates to the porch and set one on the railing. He came down, took the plate, sat on the top step with his back against the post. They ate without speaking. The eggs were plain, the bread was dry. The coffee was weak because she'd been stretching the grounds for weeks. He cleaned his plate anyway. When he was done, he set it on the step beside him and looked out across the yard, at the fence posts rotting at their bases, the chicken coop leaning east, the well pump that squeaked with every stroke. "That coop," he said, "tomorrow." Clara didn't answer, but when she took his plate back inside, she noticed her hands had stopped shaking. 2 weeks passed the way they do on a working farm, not in hours or days, but in tasks completed. Fence posts replaced, wire stretched tight, hinges oiled until they stopped their squealing. Clara unwrapped the last of the bandages on a Tuesday morning. The skin underneath had knit together, pink and tender where the deepest cracks had been. She flexed her fingers over the wash basin, watching the joints move, feeling the pull of new tissue against old. Scars in the making. But the bleeding had stopped, and she could grip a bucket handle without her vision going white at the edges. Through the kitchen window, she watched Samuel at the chicken coop. He'd torn off the rotten boards 3 days ago, stacked them in a pile for burning. Now he was fitting new ones into place, the wood so fresh she could smell the pine sap even from here. His shirt was dark between the shoulder blades, sweat soaking through despite the morning cool. She dried her hands on her apron and started breakfast. They'd fallen into a rhythm without discussing it. She cooked. He worked. They ate together on the porch, her in the chair on the left, him on the step to the right. 3 feet between them, maybe 4. Close enough to pass a plate. Far enough that their shadows never touched. He didn't talk much. Neither did she. But the silences had changed. That first morning, the quiet had felt like a wall, something to hide behind. Now it sat between them like a third person at the table present, but not unwelcome. On the 14th day, she found him by the south fence line, digging out a rotted post. The sun hung low in the west, throwing long shadows across the grass. His sleeves were pushed up past his elbows, and she could see the muscles in his forearms cord and release with each thrust of the shovel. He favored his left side when he lifted an old injury. Maybe. Something that ached when the weather turned. "Supper in an hour," she said. He nodded without turning, drove the shovel deeper into the dirt. Clara stood there a moment longer, watching. Then she said something she hadn't planned to say. "You need water, I could bring some out." He stopped, looked at her over his shoulder. "I'm fine." She walked back to the house. That evening, after the plates were cleared and the stove banked for the night, she found him on the porch. He'd dragged the second chair out, the one Thomas had carved from oak the year they were married, the one that had sat empty in the corner of the front room for 18 months. Clara stopped in the doorway. "Hope you don't mind," he said. Found it inside. Seemed a waste. Sitting there. She didn't answer. Just walked past him and sat in her own chair, the one with the worn armrests and the squeak in the left rocker. The sun was gone now, but the sky still held light at the edges, purple fading to black, stars beginning to prick through the darkness like needle holes in cloth. A coyote called somewhere to the north. Another answered. Closer. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. The nights were getting warmer, but there was still a bite in the air after sunset. Still a coolness that crept up from the ground and settled into her bones. "You got people somewhere?" The question came out before she could catch it. She felt him shift in the chair beside her, heard the creak of wood against wood. Had. A long pause. The coyotes had gone quiet. "Don't know more." Clara looked at her hands in her lap, the new scars pale in the fading light. "I understand that." He didn't ask what she meant, didn't push for details. The silence stretched between them, and for the first time it didn't feel like distance. It felt like company. "Colorado," he said finally. "Before that, Missouri. Before that," he stopped, rubbed a hand over his jaw, the stubble rasping against his palm. Nowhere that mattered. "Missouri," Clara repeated. Something in the way he'd said it, a weight on the word. "Long time ago, I was young. Did things young men do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Left things behind I shouldn't have." She waited, but he didn't say more. "And now you just move around place to place." Something like that. "Must get lonely." The word hung in the air. She wished she could take it back, shove it down her throat, Pretend she'd never said it. But it sat there between them, heavy and true. "It does," he said. The crickets had started up, filling the darkness with their high, endless song. Clara rocked back in her chair, felt the familiar squeak, the familiar give of the boards beneath her. "Thomas used to sit out here every night," she said. "After supper. Said he liked to watch the stars come out." Samuel didn't respond, but she felt him listening, felt the attention in his stillness, the way his breathing had slowed. He built this chair. Both of them. Actually. Cut the oak himself, from the grove down by the creek. She ran her fingers along the armrest, feeling the smooth grain, the slight ridge where his knife had slipped. Took him 3 months. He wasn't fast, but he was patient. "Good chairs." "They are." The stars had multiplied now, scattered across the sky like salt thrown on a black cloth. Somewhere in the barn, Maven stamped and snorted, settling in for the night. "I should turn in," Clara said. She stood, her knees popped in the quiet. "Mrs. Mercer?" She stopped. "The south fence." "Another week, maybe 2. Then the well pump." He paused. "If that's all right." Clara looked down at him. His face was half in shadow, the light from the window cutting a line across his cheek. She could see the gray in his hair, the deep lines around his eyes. 40 years of living carved into that face, maybe more. And behind it all, something she recognized, something she saw in her own mirror every morning. "It's all right," she said. She went inside, washed the last of the dishes, dried them and stacked them in the cupboard, wound the clock on the mantel, the way she did every night, the way Thomas had taught her. And then she saw it. She'd stopped in front of the fireplace without meaning to. And there it was, the tintype in its wooden frame, the one she'd propped on the mantel the week after the funeral because she couldn't bear to put it away. Her and Thomas. Wedding day, 1876. She was younger in the picture, softer, her hair pinned up in a style she hadn't worn since. And Thomas with his kind eyes, and his shy smile and his hand resting on her shoulder, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. But that wasn't what made her breath catch. The frame had been moved, just slightly, just an inch or 2 to the left. She knew because she'd been the one to place it there. 18 months ago. And she hadn't touched it since. Someone else had. Clara turned toward the window. Through the glass, she could see the porch, the 2 chairs side by side, the darkness beyond. Samuel was still sitting there, looking out at the night, his shoulders rounded, his head bowed, like a man carrying something he couldn't set down. He'd seen the photograph. He'd held it in his hands, and he hadn't said a word. The storm cellar door groaned on its hinges. Clara pulled harder, felt the wood resist, then give. The smell hit her first damp earth, old apples gone soft, the mustiness of things left too long in the dark. She hadn't been down here since last autumn, maybe longer. Samuel stood behind her, waiting. He'd offered to check the cellar that morning, said he wanted to make sure the support beams were sound before the summer storms rolled through. She'd said she would come with him. She wasn't entirely sure why. "Steps might be rotten," she said. "Watch yourself." She went down first. The wooden stairs creaked under her weight but held. At the bottom, she struck a match from the box in her apron pocket, lit the tallow candle on the shelf by the entrance. The flame caught and steadied, throwing amber light across the packed earth floor, the rows of mason jars, the wooden crates stacked against the far wall. Samuel came down behind her. His boots were loud on the steps, then quiet on the dirt. He stopped at the bottom and looked around, his eyes moving from corner to corner, cataloging. "Good cellar," he said. "Thomas dug it himself. First year we were married." The name came out before she could stop it. She'd been so careful these past 18 months, holding it inside like something fragile that might shatter if she spoke it aloud. But here in the dim light, with the smell of earth all around her and the candle flame dancing shadows on the walls, it slipped through. Thomas. She turned away, busied herself with the nearest shelf. Jars of pickled vegetables, apple preserves from 2 summers ago, tomatoes she'd canned last August, the labels written in her own hand, the ink fading now. Samuel moved deeper into the cellar. She heard him shifting crates, checking the walls for moisture, running his hands along the support beams, the way a man checks a horse's legs for heat. Professional, thorough. "Beams are solid," he said. "Won't need work for another decade, maybe more." Clara nodded, kept her eyes on the jars. Then she heard him stop. The quality of the silence changed, became weighted, careful. "Mrs. Mercer?" She turned to... He was standing in the far corner, beside a crate she hadn't opened in 18 months. The lid was off, leaning against the wall. In his hands, he held a chisel. Thomas's chisel. The one with the initials carved into the handle T.M. The one Thomas had used to shape the porch chairs, the kitchen table, the headboard of their bed. Samuel held it the way you'd hold a bird with a broken wing. Careful, aware of how easily it could be damaged further. "He made these," Clara said. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw. "Every one of them." She crossed the cellar and stood beside him, looking down into the crate. All of Thomas's tools were there, exactly where she'd put them. The chisels in their leather roll, the hand planes with their wooden bodies worn smooth from use, the saw with the handle he'd replaced twice, the mallet he'd carved from a piece of hickory he found by the creek. Back when they were first married, and everything seemed possible. "A man leaves his mark in his tools," Samuel said quietly. "You can see the shape of his hands in the wear." Clara reached into the crate and picked up the mallet. The wood was dark from years of grip, the handle curved to fit fingers that would never hold it again. She could almost feel him there. Almost. "He built this whole place," she said. "Every fence post, every beam, every board." She set the mallet back in the crate, gentle as laying down a sleeping child. Fever took him 18 months ago. 3 days from the first cough to... She stopped, pressed her lips together until she could taste blood. He didn't even know he was sick. Not really. Kept saying he'd be fine by morning. Kept trying to get up. Go back to work. A sound escaped her. Something between a laugh and a sob. "Stubborn fool. I couldn't make him stay in bed. Couldn't make him rest. And then one morning he didn't wake up. And I..." Her voice broke. Samuel set the chisel back in the crate. Careful, reverent, like he was laying something sacred to rest. He didn't say he was sorry, didn't offer comfort or platitudes. He just stood there, solid as one of the support beams, letting her words find their own place in the dark. They finished checking the cellar in silence, moved the crates that needed moving, counted jars, and marked the ones that had spoiled with a finger swipe of dust. When they were done, Clara took the candle and led the way back up the stairs. The afternoon light was blinding after the dimness below. She stood in the yard, blinking, while Samuel pulled the cellar door closed and secured the latch. "Thank you," she said, "for checking it, for—" she gestured vaguely at the air between them. "For not saying anything foolish." "Nothing foolish to say." That evening, supper was quieter than usual. Beans and cornbread, the last of the salt pork fried crisp. Clara ate without tasting. Her mind kept drifting back to the cellar, to Thomas's tools in their crate, to the mallet with his grip worn into the wood. Samuel cleaned his plate, set it on the step beside him, looked out at the darkening sky where the first stars were just beginning to show. "I had a daughter." Clara's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on some point in the middle distance, some place only he could see. Lily. She was 7 years old. Was— Clara heard the word, felt its weight. Her mother was Ruth. We had a little place outside of Colorado Springs. Nothing fancy, Paduan, but it was ours. He paused. His jaw worked, the muscles jumping beneath the skin. Fever came through the winter of 79. Took Ruth first, then Lily, 3 days later. Clara set her fork down. I buried them before the ground froze, side by side, under the cottonwood where Lily used to play. His voice was steady, but his hands had gone still on his knees, the knuckles white. After that, I couldn't stay. Sold the place, started writing. Haven't stopped since. The crickets were singing now, filling the silence between them. Clara watched his profile in the fading light, the hard line of his jaw, the grooves around his mouth, the way he held himself like a man braced against a blow that had already landed. That's why you stopped, she said. When you saw my hands, you saw someone trying to hold on alone. He didn't answer, didn't need to. You couldn't save them, she said softly. So you fix what you can. His breath caught just slightly, just enough that she noticed. Then he nodded once. A small movement, barely visible in the growing dark. Something like that. They sat there until the moon rose, neither of them speaking. The whippoorwill that lived in the oak grove started its evening call. The horses shifted and settled in the barn. Clara thought about Thomas, about Ruth and Lily, whom she'd never met and never would. About the strange arithmetic of grief, how sharing it didn't divide it, but somehow made it easier to carry. When she finally stood to go inside, she paused at the door. Samuel. He looked up. The photograph on the mantel. You looked at it. It wasn't a question. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. He had kind eyes, Samuel said. I could see why you loved him. Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, thank you, or I'm sorry, or something that would bridge the distance between his loss and hers. But the words wouldn't come. Good night, Samuel. Good night, Mrs. Mercer. She went inside and closed the door behind her. In the front room, Thomas's photograph still sat on the mantel. But for the first time in 18 months, looking at it didn't feel like drowning. It felt like remembering. And somewhere beneath the grief, so faint she almost missed it, something else stirred. Something that might have been the beginning of letting go. It scared her more than the loneliness ever had. The wagon rattled over the dried ruts in the road, each jolt traveling up through the buckboard seat and into Clara's spine. She gripped the edge of the bench with both hands, feeling the rough grain of the wood against her palms. The scars had faded to thin pink lines now, tender when she pressed too hard, but whole. Samuel sat beside her, holding the reins loose in his fingers. He hadn't said much since they'd left the farm an hour ago. Neither had she. But the silence felt different now, less like distance and more like company. The ride to Millbrook took 2 hours by wagon, the longest she'd been alone with him since he'd arrived. Not working, not eating, just sitting side by side while the prairie rolled past on either side. The grass had turned green finally, shaking off the brown of late winter. Wildflowers dotted the fields in patches of yellow and purple. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the warm currents, patient as hunger. "List," Samuel said. Clara blinked. What do you need from town?" She pulled the folded paper from her apron pocket. "Flour, salt, coffee. We're nearly out. Kerosene for the lamps." She scanned the rest of her handwriting. "Thread, if Mrs. Patterson has brown. And nails. Many as you can get for 50 cents. He nodded, clicked his tongue at the horses to keep them moving. They'd pooled their resources for this trip. Clara had managed to sell a dozen eggs to the Hendricks family last week, and Samuel had contributed money from somewhere he didn't explain. She hadn't asked. There were things about him she was learning not to push, the way he sometimes stared at nothing, the letters he never sent, the weight he carried that had nothing to do with fence posts or shingles. The town appeared on the horizon like a smudge of brown and gray against the pale sky. Millbrook. Population 312 on a good day. Fewer when the cattle drives moved on for the season. One main street. A general store. A feed shop. A blacksmith. A church with a steeple that listed slightly east. The saloon at the far end. Its piano silent this early in the afternoon. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Patterson's general store. The hitching post was empty, except for a gray mare Clara didn't recognize, and old Mr. Henley's mule, half asleep in the sun. "I'll see about the nails," Samuel said. "Feed store should have them cheaper. I'll meet you back here." Clara climbed down from the wagon, smoothing her skirt, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She could feel eyes on her already. From the feed store porch across the street, where two men stood with their arms crossed. From the window of the milliner's shop next door. She kept her chin level and walked inside. The bell above the door jangled. The smell wrapped around her immediately flour dust and tobacco, and the faint sweetness of penny candy in the glass jar by the register. Mrs. Patterson stood behind the counter, her gray hair pinned back in a bun so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes, spectacles perched on the end of her nose, hands folded over her apron. "Clara." The woman's voice was pleasant enough, but her gaze moved past Clara to the window, to the wagon outside, to the man walking toward the feed store. "Haven't seen you in town for a while." "Been busy?" "I imagine so." Mrs. Patterson pulled a ledger from beneath the counter, making a show of flipping through pages that didn't need flipping. "I heard you've got some help out at the farm these days." Clara set her list on the counter. Flour, salt, coffee, kerosene. "A man, people are saying, living in your barn. He's fixing the roof, and the fences, and the chicken coop." Clara kept her voice even, her hands flat on the counter. "Is that brown thread in stock or not?" Mrs. Patterson's lips pressed into a line thin as wire. She turned and pulled a spool from the shelf behind her, set it on the counter with a small thump. "People talk, Clara. You know how it is. A widow, living alone. And then suddenly there's a strange man. He works. I feed him. That's the arrangement. I'm sure that's all it is." The older woman began gathering items from Clara's list, her movements slow and deliberate, each item placed on the counter like a verdict. But you know how tongues wag in a small town, especially when a woman's reputation is concerned. I'm only saying this because I care about you, dear, about what people might think. Clara counted out her coins, placed them on the counter one by one, making sure Mrs. Patterson heard each clink of metal on wood. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "I'll take my goods now." She gathered the packages in her arms and walked out without waiting for change. The sun was higher now, the street busier. A wagon rolled past, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on her skirt. Children chased a spotted hound between the buildings. Normal town life, going on without her, the way it had for 18 months. Samuel was still at the feed store. She could see him through the open door, talking to someone at the counter. She started toward the wagon. Then she heard it. Laughter. Low and mean, carrying across the street like something thrown. She turned. 3 men stood on the porch of the feed store. Hank Miller, who owned the place, his belly straining against his suspenders. His brother-in-law Cobb, red-faced and thick-necked, who worked at the smithy when he wasn't drinking. And a third man, Clara didn't recognize, a cowhand passing through, judging by his dust-covered clothes and the way he leaned against the railing, like he'd bought the right to be there. They weren't looking at her. They were looking past her, toward the store where Samuel had just stepped out onto the porch, a paper sack of nails in his hand. "Taking in strays now," Cobb was saying. His voice carried, loud enough that he meant it to. "Desperate widow and some drifter? What do you reckon she's paying him with?" More laughter. The cowhand said something Clara couldn't quite catch, and Hank Miller grinned, shaking his head like he'd heard the funniest joke of the season. Clara's hands tightened on her packages. Samuel's face hadn't changed. He was walking toward the wagon, his expression blank, his pace unhurried, like he hadn't heard, or like he was used to not hearing. She should get in the wagon. She should drive away. She should let it go. The way she'd let so many things go these past 18 months, the pity, the whispered prayers, the sideways glances at church. But something in her chest had gone hard and hot, and her feet were carrying her across the street before her mind could catch up. "Clara," Samuel said behind her. She didn't turn around. The 3 men watched her approach. Cobb's grin faltered, sliding sideways on his face. Hank Miller uncrossed his arms. The cowhand just watched, curious, like he was waiting for entertainment. Clara stopped at the edge of the porch, close enough that they could smell the dust on her dress, close enough that they couldn't pretend they didn't know exactly what she'd heard. "You got something to say," she said. "You can say it to my face." Cobb's neck went red above his collar. Hank Miller found something interesting on the ground near his boots. "We were just talking, Mrs. Mercer. Didn't mean nothing by it. You were talking about my farm, my business, my hired help." She held up her hands, the scars visible now, pale lines crossing her palms like roads on a map. "You see these? I got these trying to keep my place alive, alone, for 18 months. While you stood on this porch and talked." The men said nothing. "That man," she pointed toward Samuel, who had stopped beside the wagon, watching, He showed up and fixed my roof, my fence, my chicken coop. He works from first light until he can't see his hands in front of his face. And he doesn't ask for anything but meals and a dry place to sleep. She took a step closer. Cobb stepped back. So you want to talk about what's proper, what's decent? Her voice was steady now, cold and clear as well water. You tell me what any of you have done besides stand here and run your mouths, because I don't see you fixing anybody's roof. I don't see you helping any widow keep her land. Silence. The cowhand had stopped grinning. Hank Miller was studying his boots like they held the secrets of the universe. That's what I thought. Clara turned and walked back to the wagon. Her legs were trembling beneath her skirt, but she kept her stride even, her shoulders square. She climbed up onto the seat without help. Samuel was already there, reins in hand. He didn't say anything, just clicked his tongue at the horses and turned the wagon toward home. They were 2 miles out of town before he spoke. You didn't have to do that. I know. Another mile passed. The prairie stretched out around them, endless and empty. The sky so wide it pressed down on her shoulders. Thank you, he said quietly. Clara didn't answer. She watched the road ahead, the dust rising from the horses' hooves, the farm waiting for them on the horizon. But she felt something settle in her chest. Something that had been clenched tight for a long time, finally letting go. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now, the kind that didn't need filling. When they pulled into the yard, the sun was starting its long slide toward the western hills. Samuel unhitched the horses while Clara carried the supplies inside. She was putting the flour in the pantry, the coffee in its tin. When she heard it, Maven, screaming, not a whinny, not a nicker, a scream high and ragged and full of something that sounded like pain. Clara dropped the salt and ran. The barn doors stood open. Clara ran through them without slowing, her boots sliding on the straw-scattered floor, her breath tearing out of her in ragged gasps. Maven was down. The big draft horse lay on his side in the stall, his legs thrashing against the wooden walls. His neck stretched at an angle that made Clara's stomach clench. Foam flecked his muzzle, pink-tinged. His eyes rolled back, showing white. No! The word came out broken. No! 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 She dropped to her knees beside him, reaching for his head, trying to hold him still. His body convulsed. A hoof caught her shoulder, sent her sprawling backward into the straw and muck. She scrambled up, tried again. Maven screamed that same high, terrible sound, and his legs kicked out, catching nothing but air. Clara. Samuel was behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. He pushed past her and dropped to his knees beside Maven's belly, pressing both hands flat against the swollen flesh. Colic, he said. Bad one. Bad. Might have been building all day. Do something. Her voice cracked like dry wood. Please. You have to do something. He was already moving. He grabbed the halter from the hook on the stall door, buckled it around Maven's head, wrapped the lead rope twice around his fist. Help me get him up. Can't let him stay down, he'll twist his gut. Clara seized the halter. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the leather. She pulled with everything she had. Maven's head came up, his neck straining, his legs scrabbling against the floor. Samuel was at his flank now, pushing, lifting, his boots digging into the soiled straw for purchase. The muscles in his arms stood out like ropes. Maven lurched to his feet, stood swaying, his sides heaving, his breath coming in short, wet bursts. "Walk him," Samuel said. "Around the barn? Keep him moving. Don't let him go down again." Clara took the rope, started walking. Maven stumbled beside her, his head drooping, his hooves dragging, around the barn, past the empty stalls, past the ladder to the loft, around again. Samuel disappeared through the barn door. She heard the pump handle squeaking, heard water splashing into a bucket. Then he was back, carrying the bucket and a bottle of something dark linseed oil. She realized. From the shelf in the tack room where Thomas had always kept it. "Keep walking." She walked. Her legs burned. Her shoulder throbbed where Maven's hoof had caught her. The night pressed in through the open doors, black and thick, swallowing the yard beyond. Samuel worked. He poured oil down Maven's throat, working the horse's jaw to make him swallow. He soaked cloths in warm water heated over a fire he'd built in the old feed bucket and pressed them against Maven's belly, one after another. He talked to the horse in a low, steady voice, words Clara couldn't make out. Sounds more than speech. The kind of murmuring you'd use to calm a frightened child. An hour passed, maybe 2. Clara lost count. Her world narrowed to the rope in her hands, the sound of Maven's hooves on the packed earth floor, the rhythm of one foot in front of the other. "He's not getting better," she said. Samuel didn't answer. He was pressing his ear to Maven's side, listening to something she couldn't hear. "He's dying." The words tore out of her, ugly and raw. "He's dying, and I can't do this again. I can't lose him too. Keep walking." Thomas raised him from a foal. He was there when Thomas... Her voice broke into pieces. "He's all I have left. Don't you understand? He's all I have left of him." Samuel looked up. His face was streaked with sweat, his shirt soaked through, his eyes red-rimmed from the smoke of the fire. "Then we don't let him go," he said. "Keep walking." She walked. Her legs screamed. Her hands went numb on the rope. The lantern cast jumping shadows on the walls, making the barn feel like somewhere underwater, somewhere strange. And then Maven stopped. His legs splayed. His head dropped. Clara pulled on the rope. He didn't move. "Come on," she said. "Come on, Maven, please." His knees buckled. Clara braced herself and hauled on the rope with everything she had left. The leather cut into her palms, her healed palms, the scars splitting open again, fresh blood welling up. She didn't care. She pulled harder. Maven went down. His weight dragged her forward. She stumbled, her feet tangling in the straw, and then she was falling, her knees hitting the ground, her hands sinking into the muck, the wet, reeking mixture of straw and manure and urine that covered the stall floor. She tried to get up. Her hands slipped. She went down again, this time onto her elbows, her face inches from the filth. The smell hit her like a fist ammonia and rot, and the sour sweetness of sick animal. She pushed herself up onto her knees. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were covered in black muck, the blood from her palms mixing with the filth. She could feel it soaking through her skirts, cold and wet against her legs. Maven lay still beside her. His eyes were closed. His sides barely moved. Clara crouched there in the muck, her bloody hands pressed against the floor, her whole body shaking. She'd lost Thomas. She'd nearly lost the farm. And now Maven, who Thomas had loved, Maven, who was the last living thing that still remembered her husband's voice, her husband's hands, her husband's gentle way with animals. Maven was dying too. She couldn't do this anymore. The thought came cold and clear, like water from a winter well. She couldn't keep fighting. Couldn't keep holding on. Couldn't keep pretending that any of it mattered. That she mattered. That anything she did made any difference at all. She let go of the rope, sat back on her heels in the filth, and stopped. Just stopped. Clara, Samuel's voice. Close. He was kneeling beside her, his hands on her shoulders, his face inches from hers. Look at me. She looked. His eyes were steady, calm. The same eyes that had looked at her hands that first morning and seen something worth saving. He's not dead yet, Samuel said. And neither are you. He stood, took the rope from her slack fingers, wrapped it around his own hands that knew horses, that had held them through birth and sickness and death, that moved with a certainty she had never possessed. Get up, boy, he said to Maven, low and firm. Come on now. Get up. He pulled, not hard steady, insistent. The way you'd pull a drowning man toward shore. Maven's eyes opened. Clara watched from the muck. Her dress was destroyed. Her hands were bleeding and filthy. She could feel the wet seeping through to her skin. Smell herself now. The stink of failure and manure and exhausted sweat. Maven's front legs shifted. His hooves scraped against the floor. That's it, Samuel said. That's it. Come on, boy. One leg under him, then the other. Samuel kept pulling, kept talking. That same low, steady voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. Maven stood, Hawa. He swayed. His legs trembled, but he stood. Samuel walked him forward. 1 step. 2. Around the barn in a slow, careful circle. The horse followed, his head hanging low, his breath still labored, but moving. Alive. Clara stayed where she was, on her knees in the filth, too exhausted to stand, too ashamed to try. The night wore on. Samuel kept walking, kept talking, kept pressing his hands to Maven's belly, listening, checking. At some point he made Clara get up, not with words, just with a look, a gesture toward the house. She went, washed her hands at the pump, the cold water turning brown and then pink and then clear, changed her dress in the dark of her bedroom, stuffing the ruined one into the corner where she wouldn't have to look at it, made coffee because she didn't know what else to do. When she carried the pot back to the barn, the sky was starting to lighten at the edges, pink bleeding into gray, the first birds stirring in the trees. Maven was still standing. His breathing had steadied. His eyes were clear. Samuel stood beside him, one hand resting on the horse's neck, the other hanging loose at his side. His shirt was soaked through. His face was gray with exhaustion, but his lips curved upward just slightly, just enough to notice. He'll make it, he said. Clara set down the coffee pot, walked into the stall, stood in front of Maven, who lifted his head and nuzzled her shoulder, his breath warm and soft against her neck. She wrapped her arms around him and wept, Not the ugly, broken crying from before. Something quieter. Something that felt like letting go instead of falling apart. The tears came, and she let them. Her face pressed against Maven's coat. Her hands fisted in his mane. When she finally stepped back, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, Samuel was watching her. "Thank you," she said. The words weren't enough. She knew they weren't enough, but she said them anyway. He nodded, picked up the empty linseed oil bottle and set it on the shelf, ran a hand through his hair, which was sticking up in all directions, matted with sweat and straw. "You should get some rest," he said. "Both of you." He turned toward the barn door, toward the loft where his cot waited, toward another day of work that would start in a few hours whether he slept or not. But Clara's voice stopped him. "Samuel." He looked back. She stood in the stall, her dress wrinkled, her hair falling loose from its pins, her face streaked with tears and dust and exhaustion. Maven stood beside her, solid and breathing and alive. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you really stay?" He didn't answer right away. The question hung between them, heavier than the silence had ever been. Then he said something that made her breath catch in her throat. "Because I couldn't do nothing for them. But maybe," he stopped, started again. "Maybe I could do something here." He walked out of the barn before she could respond. Clara stood alone in the stall, his words echoing in the quiet, and realized she didn't know which them he meant, Ruth and Lily, buried under the cottonwood in Colorado, or someone else he'd never told her about. The last shingle slid into place. Samuel drove the nail home with 2 clean strokes, the sound ringing out across the quiet morning. He sat back on his heels and looked at what he'd built. The roof stretched beneath him, solid and whole, every gap filled, every weak spot reinforced, cedar shingles overlapping in tight rows, the way his father had taught him 40 years ago on a farm in Missouri that probably didn't exist anymore. 6 weeks of work, done. He should feel something. Satisfaction. Maybe pride. Instead, there was just a hollowness behind his ribs, a weight settling in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion. The work was finished. There was no reason to stay. Samuel climbed down the ladder slowly, his muscles protesting with each rung. At the bottom, he stood in the yard and turned in a slow circle. The chicken coop stood straight on its new foundation, the wire mesh tight and secure. The fence posts he'd replaced marched in a clean line toward the south pasture, though that fence still needed work, sagging in the middle where the old posts had rotted through. The barn door hung true on its oiled hinges. The well pump no longer squeaked. Everything he'd said he'd come to fix was fixed. He walked to the barn. His horse waited in the stall beside Maven's, the bay gelding he'd ridden in on 6 weeks ago. A lifetime ago. The saddle hung on its peg where he'd left it, the leather dry from disuse. His saddlebags sat in the corner, still packed with the few things he owned: a change of clothes, his razor, the photograph of Ruth and Lily he couldn't bring himself to look at anymore. He lifted the saddle, set it on his horse's back, reached under the belly for the girth strap. His hands stopped. He stood there, frozen, one hand on the saddle horn and the other on the leather strap, and couldn't make himself pull it tight. What was waiting for him out there? Another town? Another fence that needed mending? Another stranger who might look at him the way Clara had looked at him that first morning, with suspicion and need. and something underneath that he'd learned not to name. He'd been writing for 5 years since Ruth and Lily died. 5 years of moving from place to place, fixing what needed fixing, leaving before anyone got too close, before anyone asked questions he couldn't answer, before anyone looked at him the way Clara looked at him now, like maybe he was something more than a pair of useful hands. It was easier that way, safer, nobody to lose if you never let yourself have anyone. But Clara's face kept rising behind his eyes. The way she'd looked at him after Maven lived, the tears on her cheeks, the question she'd asked, "Why did you stay?" and the answer he'd given, the answer that had scraped something raw inside him. Because I couldn't do nothing for them. But maybe I could do something here. He'd meant Ruth and Lily. That's what he'd told himself. But standing here in the barn, his hand on a saddle he couldn't seem to tighten, he knew that wasn't the whole truth. There was Missouri. There was Margaret. There was a summer 22 years ago when he'd been 18 and stupid and running from a shotgun and a father's fury, leaving behind a girl he'd promised to come back for. He'd never gone back to never written, never found out what happened to her. Some things you buried so deep you almost forgot they were there. Almost. Samuel let go of the girth strap, stepped back from the horse, pressed both hands against the stall door, and let his head hang. He could leave. He should leave. Every instinct he'd built over 5 years of solitary riding told him to saddle up and go before this got any harder. Before Clara became someone he couldn't walk away from. Before this place started feeling like home. But that was the problem, wasn't it? It already did. He thought about Ruth, the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day, her eyes bright with a future neither of them could see, the way she'd sung to Lily in the rocking chair by the fire, old songs her mother had taught her, the way she'd told him, in those final fevered hours, that he had to keep living, that he couldn't let grief turn him into a ghost. He'd tried to honor that, tried to keep moving, keep working, keep putting one foot in front of the other. But somewhere along the way, living had turned into surviving, and surviving had turned into running, and running had turned into hiding from everyone who might make him feel something he'd sworn never to feel again. Maybe it was time to stop. Samuel straightened, pulled the saddle off his horse, and hung it back on its peg. The walk to the house seemed longer than it should. His boots crunched on the gravel path. The sun was fully up now, painting the yard in shades of gold and green. From the barn behind him, Maven nickered a greeting or a blessing. He couldn't tell which. Clara was on the porch. She stood at the railing with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her face turned toward the barn. Watching him, she'd changed into a clean dress, the blue one, the one that made her eyes look like deep water. Her hair was pinned up, but a few strands had escaped, curling against her neck in the morning warmth. She didn't speak as he crossed the yard. Neither did he. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looked up at her. She looked down at him. The space between them felt charged, heavy, with things neither of them had said. "Roof's done," he said. "I saw you up there this morning." He nodded, put one boot on the bottom step, rested his hand on the railing. "I was thinking," he said, "about the south pasture fence." Clara's fingers tightened on her coffee cup. "What about it? Why, won't hold past July. Not the way it is now." "I know. Someone ought to see to it. Someone ought—" The words sat between them, the same words they'd spoken before, weeks ago, on a morning that felt like another lifetime. But the meaning had shifted, deepened, become something that had nothing to do with fences. Samuel took another step, then another. He was on the porch now, standing 3 feet from her, close enough to smell the coffee on her breath and the lavender soap she used on her hair. "I could stay," he said. "If you wanted." Clara set down her cup. Her hands were trembling. He could see the shake in her fingers, the way she pressed them against the railing to hide it. "The barn loft gets cold," she said, "come winter. I've slept in worse. The work never stops. Something's always breaking. Something's always wearing out." "I know." "And the town," her voice caught. "The town will talk. They'll say things about both of us, both of..." Yet Samuel thought about Cobb and Hank Miller on the feed store porch. The way Clara had walked across that dusty street and stood them down, her spine straight, her voice steady, the way she'd defended him without hesitating. Let them talk. Clara's eyes met his. He saw the question there, the fear and the hope tangled together, the wanting she was too proud to name. "Why?" she asked. "You could go anywhere, find easier work, a place where nobody knows you." "I could. Then why stay here? Why stay with..." She stopped herself, looked away. Samuel moved closer, close enough now that he could see the pulse beating fast in her throat, the slight flush on her cheeks. "Because I'm tired," he said, "tired of running. Tired of waking up in new places and not caring if I see another sunrise." He paused. "I stopped here because of your hands, but I stayed because of you." Clara's breath caught. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "I don't know if I can..." She shook her head. "Thomas has only been gone 18 months. I don't know if I'm ready to..." "I'm not asking for anything," Samuel said. "Just a chance, just time, however much you're willing to give." The morning stretched around them. Birds sang in the oak grove. The wind moved through the grass, making it ripple like water. Maven whickered again from the barn. And this time it sounded like approval. Clara reached out. Her fingers brushed his hand where it rested on the railing. Light, careful. A touch that asked more than it offered. "The south pasture fence," she said. "How long do you reckon it'll take?" "Couple weeks, maybe 3. And after that, there'll be something else." He turned his hand over, let her fingers rest in his palm. Her skin was warm. The scars had faded to thin white lines. "There's always something else. If you want me to stay." Clara looked at their hands, hers, marked by 18 months of solitary work. His rough, with 40 years of labor. 2 people worn down by loss, finding their way toward something that might be hope. "Stay," she said. Samuel let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. His fingers closed around hers, gentle but sure. Behind them, the screen door creaked in the wind. In front of them, the farm spread out in the morning light, the fields waiting to be tended, the fences waiting to be mended, the future waiting to be built. He was about to say something. What? He didn't know when the sound reached him. Hoofbeats, coming fast down the road from town. Samuel turned, shaded his eyes against the sun. A rider was pushing hard toward the farm. The horse's coat was dark with sweat, flecked with foam at the mouth. The rider sat forward in the saddle, urging more speed. Clara came down the porch steps to stand beside him. Her hand found his again, her fingers lacing through his. "Who is that?" she asked. Samuel squinted against the light. The rider was closer now, close enough to make out a young man's face. 18, maybe 20, dark hair under a battered hat. clothes that had seen hard travel dust on the boots, sweat stains on the shirt. But it was the eyes that stopped Samuel's heart. Gray blue, the exact shade he saw in the mirror every morning. The exact shade Ruth's eyes had been. The rider pulled up in the yard, his horse blowing hard, and swung down from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped. "Are you Samuel Holloway?" he demanded. "From Missouri." Samuel's throat went dry. His hand tightened on Clara's. "Who's asking?" The young man stepped forward. His jaw was set, his fists clenched at his sides. But beneath the anger, Samuel saw something else, something that looked like hope and hurt, and 20 years of wondering. "My name is Daniel," the young man said. "Daniel Holloway. My mother was Margaret Dunn." The morning went silent. Even the birds stopped singing. "She told me to find you," Daniel said. "She told me you were my father?" Samuel's legs stopped working. He stood in the yard, the morning sun hot on his shoulders, Clara's hand still in his, and stared at the young man who had just claimed to be his son, Daniel Holloway, Margaret Dunn's boy. The name hit him like a mule kick to the chest. "I don't—" Samuel started. His voice came out wrong, scraped raw. "I didn't know." "Of course you didn't." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You left before she could tell you. Rode off in the middle of the night and never looked back. Margaret. 22 years ago. A summer in Missouri, when he'd been 18 and foolish, when her father had come after him with a shotgun and he'd run like the coward he was. He'd told himself he'd go back, told himself he'd write. But the weeks had turned to months, the months to years. And eventually he'd convinced himself that she'd moved on, found someone better, forgotten about the boy who'd promised her things he couldn't deliver. He'd never known about the child. Clara's hand tightened on his. He felt her looking at him, felt the question in her grip, but he couldn't turn away from Daniel's face, from those gray-blue eyes that were his own eyes, staring back at him with 20 years of anger and hurt. "She's gone," Daniel said. His voice cracked on the word. 6 months ago. Consumption took her. Samuel closed his eyes. Margaret. Brown hair and a laugh like creek water, the smell of honeysuckle on her father's porch, the way she'd kissed him goodbye that last morning, not knowing it was the last. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt small, useless. "I'm sorry, Daniel. She made me promise to find you." Daniel's hands were shaking at his sides. "Made me swear on her deathbed. Said you deserved to know. Said I deserved to meet you." He laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. "I'm not sure I agree with her." Clara stepped forward. Her hand slipped from Samuel's, and for a moment he felt unmoored, adrift. But then she was walking toward Daniel, her steps steady and sure. "You've had a long ride," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday. Come inside. I'll make coffee." Daniel looked at her, at Samuel, at the farm spread out around them, the mended fences, the straight chicken coop, the barn with its new roof gleaming in the sun. "Who are you?" he asked. "Clara Mercer?" "This is my land." She gestured toward the house. "Whatever needs saying can be said at the table. But it'll be said over food and coffee, not standing in the dirt like strangers." She turned and walked up the porch steps. The screen door banged shut behind her. Daniel stood in the yard, his horse still blowing hard behind him. His face was a war of emotions, anger, confusion, something that might have been hope. She always could manage people, he said quietly. Knew how to make folks do what she wanted without them realizing they'd agreed to anything. Samuel nodded. I remember that about her. They looked at each other. Father and son, strangers. I'm not asking for anything, Daniel said. Mom, not money, not a name, I've got my own life and just... He stopped, swallowed hard. I wanted to see what kind of man you were. That's all. Come inside, Samuel said. Please. The kitchen was warm with the smell of coffee brewing. Clara had set 3 cups on the table, her cup, Samuel's cup, and a third she must have pulled from the back of the cupboard. She'd moved the chairs, too, making room around the small table for 3 people instead of 2. Samuel sat. Daniel sat across from him, his hat in his hands, his eyes moving around the room, taking in the stove. The cast-iron skillets hanging on their hooks, the tintype photograph visible through the doorway to the front room. Clara poured the coffee, set the pot in the middle of the table. Then she sat beside Samuel, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Tell me, Samuel said. Samuel, about her, about you, about the life she had. Daniel talked. The words came slowly at first, pulled out like splinters from old wood. Margaret had waited for Samuel for 2 years after he left. Then she'd married a farmer named Cole, a good man, Daniel said, who'd treated her well and raised Daniel as his own. Cole had died when Daniel was 12, thrown from a horse during a storm. After that, Margaret had taken in sewing and laundry, done whatever she could to keep them fed. Daniel had worked from the time he was old enough to hold a hammer. She never blamed you, Daniel said. That's what I couldn't understand. I'd get so angry, thinking about the man who left her alone and pregnant, and she'd just shake her head and say you didn't know, say you would have stayed if you'd known. Samuel's throat ached. He thought about the boy he'd been at 18, scared, running, too young to understand what staying meant. I would have, he said. If I'd known, I would have come back. Would you? The question hung in the air, honest, unflinching. Samuel thought about it, really thought. The boy he'd been, the man he'd become, the years of running, of hiding, of convincing himself that he didn't deserve the things other men had. I don't know, he said finally. I want to say yes, but I was young and stupid and scared, and I don't know what that boy would have done. He met Daniel's eyes. I know what this man would do, but that doesn't help you much. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. The anger didn't disappear, but it moved aside, making room for something else. Recognition. Maybe. Or the beginning of understanding. That's more honest than I expected, he said. Clara reached across the table. Her hand covered Samuel's where it rested beside his coffee cup. Her fingers laced through his, her palm warm and dry, the old scars pressing against his calluses. Stay for supper, she said to Daniel. Stay the night if you want. There's room in the barn loft. Daniel looked at her, at Samuel, at their joined hands. "You sure?" "I'm sure." The day passed in a strange kind of peace. Daniel helped with the evening chores, feeding the chickens, hauling water, checking on Maven, who was still recovering in his stall. Samuel worked beside him, showing him where things were kept, how the pump needed to be primed, which gate latch stuck. They didn't talk much, but the silence was different than it had been that morning. Less hostile, more like two men learning to be in the same space. Supper was simple: cornbread and beans. A pot of stew Clara had started that morning. They ate at the table, Clara at one end, Samuel at the other, Daniel between them. The lamp threw golden light across their faces, softening the hard edges of the day. "I'll head out in the morning," Daniel said as Clara cleared the plates. "Got work lined up in Dodge City, but I could—" He paused. "If it's all right, I could come back through sometime. Check in." Samuel looked at him, at the gray-blue eyes that were his own, at the young man who'd crossed Kansas to find a father and discovered something more complicated than he'd expected. "You're welcome here," Samuel said. "Anytime you want." Clara nodded. "Anytime." After Daniel went to the barn, Samuel and Clara sat on the porch. The stars had come out, scattered across the sky like salt on black cloth. The crickets sang their high, endless song. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. "You didn't tell me about Margaret," Clara said. "I didn't remember her. Not until today." Samuel stared out at the darkness. "I'd buried it so deep I'd almost convinced myself it never happened. The running, the hiding, it wasn't just from the grief. It was from everything I'd done wrong, everything I'd left behind. And now I've got to figure out how to stop running." He turned to look at her. "If you'll still have me." Clara was quiet for a moment. The rocking chair creaked beneath her. Then she reached over and took his hand. "There's things about Thomas I never told you," she said. "Good things and hard things. Ways I failed him that I've never said out loud." Her fingers tightened on his. "We've all got pieces we've buried. Doesn't mean we have to stay buried with them." Samuel turned his hand over, let her palm rest in his. Her skin was warm. The scars had faded to thin white lines, barely visible in the lamplight. "We've got a lot of talking to do," he said. "We've got time." They sat there until the moon rose, neither of them speaking. The lamp in the kitchen window threw a square of gold onto the porch boards. In the barn, Maven stamped and settled. In the loft above, Daniel was probably lying awake, thinking about the father he'd found and the mother he'd lost. And here, on this porch, two people sat together in the darkness with their hands intertwined. "Storm coming tomorrow?" Clara said finally. "I'll check the roof." "You already checked it twice today." "Might check it again." She laughed, a real laugh, soft and low, surprised out of her like something she'd forgotten she knew how to do. Samuel felt it settle in his chest, that sound, that small, unexpected gift. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. Tomorrow there would be fences to mend, and conversations to have, and a young man to say goodbye to. Tomorrow there would be questions without easy answers, and a past that would take years to untangle. Tomorrow the work would start again, the endless cycle of building and fixing and holding things together. But tonight the sky was clear. The roof was solid. The table was set for 3. And Samuel Holloway, for the first time in 22 years, was exactly where he was supposed to be. There is something quiet that lingers after a story like this. Something that sits in the chest without asking to be named or explained. It simply rests there, heavy, and familiar. Like an old ache that has learned to keep us company through the years. Many of us have stood where Clara stood alone in a yard, holding on to something that kept slipping away. Many of us have known what it is to be seen by a stranger when the people who should have been looking had already turned away. And perhaps some of us have been Samuel, too carrying things we buried so deep we almost forgot they were there, moving from place to place, searching for something we could not name until we stumbled upon it by accident. These feelings do not need to be resolved tonight. They are allowed to rest here, unfinished. The way most true things in life remain. A story ends. But the people in it keep living somewhere beyond the last word. That has always been enough. It will always be enough. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening with your whole heart.